All right, good afternoon. My name is Brandon Carter. I'm an application engineer with Ally PLM Solutions. I want to welcome everyone to this Ally PLM NX Lunch Bytes series. I notice we have a few new people, I believe. For those of you not familiar with Lunch Bytes is a series briefly to explore capabilities within NX that are often overlooked. Please check our website for upcoming Lunch Bytes topics and dates. We want our Lunch Bytes to be valuable to you, so please let us hear your suggestions on topics we should cover, and if you'll send those to us via email, or also there is a spot on our website to request Lunch Bytes topics. If you have any questions regarding today's session, please just write them down and send them in an email. There's several of you on the line with us today, therefore you'll be in listen-only mode. Today's topic is on what's new in NX 8.5 CAD. We're going to break this topic into two sessions. We'll do half of the session today over the next 30 minutes, and then part two will conclude next month on April 18th. We try to keep our sessions short to 30 minutes. That's why we're doing this over two sessions. Our goal today is to give you some insight on what's new in NX 8.5 CAD, as I mentioned earlier. There are many more items that are new, but in today's session and next month's session, we're going to focus on some items that will help you with both productivity and are those everyday type tools no matter what types of parts you design and model. With that, let's get started. So here's a high-level agenda. Like I said, we're going to break it up in two sessions. Today we're going to cover user interface sketching and modeling, and then the next session on April 18th we'll look at what's new in synchronous modeling, what's new in sheet metal, drafting, and if time permits we'll look at some other tools. So to start us off here, we're going to look at user interface, just listed here, just kind of what I went through and looked at from a user interface perspective of what's most important, what everyone will notice. You're going to notice there's no more dialog rail. There's a new shortcut toolbar added. We're going to look at some rotate fit enhancements. There's a new see-through preview. There's a new simplified measurements toolbar. And then just as a mentionable item, underneath measure distance, underneath analysis measure distance, they've added a diameter option, not just the radius. So first of all, the new shortcut toolbar. Here's an example. This is actually called the View shortcut toolbar. And what this is going to do, when I click out in space, I'm going to get a customizable toolbar. In this case, I have Sketch, Extrude, some tools that I'm going to use for today's presentation, customize out there. This View toolbar, as I mentioned, this is only going to display if you've customized this by adding commands to it. Whenever we look at this just in a minute underneath Tools Customize, I'm going to show you how to interact, and really most of the presentation you'll see me interact with this new toolbar. But however, in the Customize you'll see there's View, which is above, all objects and all features. So the way this works, if I select something, in this case I'm grabbing an existing feature, in area 1 of the toolbar are object-specific commands. So if this is an extrude or a unite or whatever it may be, then these are going to be commands like edit parameters, hide, delete, you know, what you'd see when you right-click on extrude in your parts navigator. The second area of this are commands added to all feature shortcut toolbar. So underneath all features, meaning whenever I grab any type of feature, whether it's extrude, revolve, unite, whatever, then these set of tools will show up in the floating toolbar. And finally, all objects, anything I've listed underneath all objects will show up no matter what I have selected on the screen. Those in area 3 will show up what I have added under all objects. So we'll take a look at that, and like I said, we'll be using that as we go throughout the rest of the presentation. There's a new see-through preview. This was one of those enhancements I kind of was going to leave off, and then I started using NX 8.5 when I made my list a while back, and I thought, you know, this is actually really handy, and I want users to understand some of the differences even out of the box. So in this case, this is very handy for adding those treatment features. In the example I have on the screen, we're adding edge blends. And you'll notice that it emphasizes what features are being created, basically dims the rest of the model. So that's called see-through preview. I'll show you where the button is to turn that off if you want to. As a mentionable item, there's also a group of tools called simple measure tools rather than just measure tools. So all your old tools, your analysis, measure distance, measure angle, etc., as you see down here, are still there. But what they've done is they've kind of repackaged those ideas and put simple in front of them. And what you'll notice in the dialog box is it's just a quick start, finish, I get my measurement, okay. All right, it's used, they're there to obtain measurements very quickly. So in other words, I don't have to go into the full-blown measurement tool and, you know, there's the option to open it up in the information window. There's several groups of options there. This is just a quick, dirty, what's my measurement? And you see how they're grouped as simple in front of the commands. Here in a minute, I'm going to open up an example and go through some of these in a demo for you. But there are some rotate fit enhancements with NX 8.5. First of all, being able to rotate about what you're centered on in the screen. What NX is going to do is take an arbitrary center of rotation located in the center of the visible geometry of the work part. So if I have a large assembly and only part of it's shown, it's going to rotate about the center of what's shown. It's going to allow us to keep our rotation of our focus of what we're working on. Also, if we make a work part inside of the context of the assembly, then our focus, our rotation point, center of rotation I should say, will be about that point. Now we can set our own rotation, clear our own rotation, and I'll go through that. Over here on the right, there are some fit enhancements. If you go to Preferences Visualization, go to the View/Screen tab, you'll see that for your session settings, you can, for example, turn on this fit on show or hide. So if I hide something or show something, it'll automatically do a fit. You see some other options here like exclude datums from fit. You know, if I have something out in space, that may help with that. Fit to work section and so forth. The biggest thing I want you to be aware of these new options. All right, let's go ahead and take a quick look at some of these items. Here we have a distributor cap in progress, and this will be an example we use later to show what's new in modeling. But the first thing we want to look at is what we saw on the slides, is this floating toolbar. So if I just click out in space, I just did a single left click. These are some tools I threw on here for this presentation. So, you know, sketch, extrude, block, unite, etc. Notice here, if I click on an existing feature, I get a different floating toolbar as we saw on the slide. So these are object-specific tools like edit parameters and delete and hide and show, etc. If I right-click on the feature, we're used to seeing our shortcut menu, but notice how that floating toolbar will also appear. Okay, a little tip and trick that I've seen, if I'm over top of a part, like I said, and I click and select it, that object defined toolbar comes up. But if I click over top and hold down Control, notice how the version of the toolbar called the View shortcut toolbar comes up just as if I clicked out in space. If I go to Tools, Customize here quickly, notice the new tab called Shortcut Toolbars. So here is the View version. This is where I clicked out in space, so I've customized these tools. If you do not customize this view, when you click out in space and not select anything, you will not see that toolbar. And as I mentioned on the slide, there's all objects and all features, which I have not customized for this presentation. So I just want to make you aware, you're going to see this floating toolbar in action a lot, not only in the presentation, but whenever you get into NX 8.5 if you haven't already. The next thing, let me go ahead and switch to the kind of the beginnings of this part. This is just the base feature where I've revolved. And for example, maybe I want to grab an edge blend. I'm going to use that floating toolbar. And notice as I start grabbing edges to blend, it turns into this see-through preview, right? So it's really emphasizing what I'm creating. And doing items like this with complex blends and some other treatment features, this is a very handy tool. Just going to cancel out of that. For example, if I want to turn that off, here's my View toolbar. I can just go to the end of the toolbar, go to Add and Remove Buttons, View, and you'll see the button for See-Through Preview. I just added it to there. Notice it's on by default. If I turn that off, then that'll turn off the See-Through Preview. So you can add that button to toggle on and off. We'll also see the See-Through Preview as we go on with the rest of the presentation today. Let me switch over to an assembly, and the next thing we want to talk about are the view and rotate enhancements, really the rotate and fit enhancements. So one of the things you've probably noticed in the past is, you know, you have a large assembly or even maybe a large part and you're zoomed up real tight and you start to rotate and it starts to swing that guy off the page. This here is rocket car. You guys may have seen something about this on the internet. They're an NX customer. Right now I'm using my 3D mouse device, just rotating back and forth. And notice the little white circles on the center of the screen. That is showing me the center of rotation. Even if I don't use my 3D mouse and I just use my middle mouse button now, you see how it's picking up that same center of rotation. For example, if I zoom up on the back of this assembly and I press down my middle mouse button to start to rotate, you'll see that it's changing the center of rotation. It's keeping my focus to whatever I am zoomed up on. And I know that's probably a little delayed over the web. I apologize for that. But you see that now I'm rotating more towards the back of the assembly. Also, if I make this wheel, the work part, to work in the context of the assembly, and I hold down my middle mouse button, notice how it's going to apply the focus or center of rotation to the center of the work part, even though a lot of that assembly is out in space, so to speak, to the right. So that's very, very handy. What you're going to notice is this is going to allow you to rotate easier and keep your focus of the area of where you are zoomed up on, for example. If I right-click out in space, I can set a rotation reference. For example, I'm just going to come over here and grab a point, hold down my middle mouse wheel, and I've specified that center of rotation. I can right-click, clear that rotation, and it'll go back to being the center of the visible geometry. Like I said, that arbitrary center of rotation located in the center of visible geometry of the work part. Another thing, if I wanted to come up here and set a different rotation, I'm going to set the rotation reference. I have a little spine up here that I want to rotate about. Hold down my middle mouse button. Now you see I'm rotating about that spine because I set my rotation point. So just to give you some ideas, and also just to show you some of the enhancement there with that particular rotation. As far as the fit enhancements, said that was underneath preferences visualization. The one we're going to look at here is the fit on show or hide. So I've toggled that on. If I zoom up on the back of my assembly and I come over here and hide one of these particular sub-assemblies, notice how it automatically do a fit the screen as I do that operation. If I zoom back up and I come over and right-click and say show, see how it fits and does an automatic fit after that. So just be aware there are some fit preferences added to help you be more productive as you go there. All right. The next thing we'll talk about is sketching. So a couple mentionable items here. Remove the Z-axis on sketch for 8.5. Put points on vertices for feedback and editing. Constraints, there's been a few options changed with constraints. For example, change the constraint symbols. The one in particular I want you to be aware of is the tangent symbol. I'll show you a screenshot of that and also show you in a demo how that's changed so you're aware of it. Constraint has priority on pre-selection, meaning that it'll be easier to select and delete because, you know, or I guess not because, but rather than selecting the curve and deleting. And also, what about adding constraints? There's a new constraint dialog, and then the ability to use that new shortcut floating toolbar I just showed you, adding constraints. And also an enhancement with rectangle from center. If we select that key point, it will now infer those midpoint constraints. So here, just to get a comparison, because if some of this you may have not noticed, you may not notice some of this is new in 8.5. Some of you may definitely notice some of this behavior because it may have bothered you before. But anyway, so here on the right is NX 8.0. And you see that that Z-axis is pointing off of there. And in 8.5, if I rotate that coordinate system around, you see there's no longer a Z-axis. Right? We're sketching X and Y. We're sketching 2D geometry on the datum plane. We do not need that Z-axis sticking out. This one you'll see a little more in the demo. Added points to vertices for feedback and editing. So on the right you have NX8, on the left you have NX 8.5. The biggest thing I want to point out are some of the glyphs for the constraints. The biggest one is tangent. So on the right, you have the circles in 8.0 and older, you know, showing us that there's tangency between that line and that arc. Over here in 8.5, you're going to notice this vertical bar. What I can tell, this is the one that's really kind of drastically changed, but you can always go to Help and look at the What's New guide, and there's actually a table in there that shows all the pictures or glyphs of those constraints. The constraints dialog, this is a pretty big one. Constraint dialog has been updated and shortcut toolbar added. So on the right, in NX 8.0 and older, you're used to going into constraints, you pick your geometry, and as you pick geometry and add it to your select set, it starts filtering down what your possible constraints could be. You know, whether it's collinear or a horizontal or vertical line or equal length, etc. In 8.5, when you go into the constraints button, you're going to get this new dialog, and it's going to be more action object. Action object means I'm going to pick the constraint as an action, pick what geometry I want to constrain, and then what geometry I want to constrain it to. Okay, so I'm going to show you that in action. Also, that floating toolbar I mentioned in the last little section, as I start picking geometry, even without going into constraints, if I pick 2 lines, this floating toolbar will come up and almost do like we did in the previous versions and filter down what possible options are for constraints based on my select set. In this case, with the floating toolbar, I didn't have to go into the constraints tool or environment per se. And finally here, rectangle from center now infers midpoint constraints if created from a key point. Here I have the continuous auto dimensioning turned on. So in 8.0, if I do rectangle from center, grab this origin, define my rectangle, not only is it popping those dimensions for the height and width out, but it's also popping out those auto dimensions for, you know, off the origin of the sketch. Whereas here in 8.5, if I do the same technique, create that rectangle from center, notice how I only get 2 auto dimensions for the height and width, and it's also inferring those midpoint constraints here. Also notice the vertices are adding, so I can see a little easier what those constraints are pointing to. Obviously the goal here is, hey, you've snapped to a point, let's infer some constraints to help us maintain symmetry or that particular design intent. How many times over here in 8.0 and older have you done a rectangle by center, and maybe rather than using the 2 auto dimensions, you come in and add your own midpoint constraints as it's shown here? Okay, let's take a look at some of the sketcher topics. Okay, I'm going to just open a brand new part file since we're talking about sketching, and I'm going to use my floating toolbar, and let's just come into a sketch. Before I do that, let me cancel out. Let me get rid of my work coordinate system just so we can talk about the z-axis. It'll be a little easier to see. So I'm going to grab a sketch, define that sketch. If I rotate this guy around, you'll notice there's no z-axis coming off the front of that anymore. All right, it's a 2D sketch. We need X and Y. We do not need that z-axis. All right, so I'm just going to create the shape that I had on the slide. I'm going to turn off continuous auto dimensioning for right now. Just create that profile. So let's talk a little bit about the constraints. First of all, you'll notice the little origin or the vertice points, a little easier to see, a little easier to grab and drag as we had in previous versions. But as far as the constraints dialog, if I come up here to constraints now in 8.5, I'm going to get this action object toolbar. Another thing I mentioned on the slide, not to revert back, but if I hold down my left mouse button, notice how there's no longer a dialog rail across there. But if you'll move the cursor up, you'll kind of feel it snap up to where that rail used to exist. So it does feel like you dock it. So that functionality is there, but we don't have the rail to slide along anymore. Okay, back to the constraints. So here maybe I want to set 2 line segments equal to each other, equal length. So I'm going to grab equal length, grab one segment, and say constrain that equally to the other. Right? So it's this action object type approach. However, as I mentioned, if you're used to the more object action, meaning I pick the geometry, then pick the constraint, if I grab a line and another line, you'll see that it pops up that floating toolbar, and as we discussed the organization, but notice how it pops up those constraints, available constraints here without even going into the constraints dialog. So if I just grab equal length, I've done that. So that's very, very quick just by grabbing geometry and accessing the constraint on the floating toolbar. Let me go ahead and get rid of this, and let's toggle back on continuous auto dimensioning. and let's look at that rectangle by center, or rectangle from center enhancement. So I'm going to come in here and grab this sketch origin, define my rectangle, and because I picked on a key point, whether it's a key point on the end of another line segment or here on the origin, notice how it automatically added those midpoint constraints. So now I only have 2 auto dimensions, which in this case is nice. I can just take those and turn them driving and drive the shape. So like I said, a little productivity gain, especially if you found yourself manually going in and adding those midpoint constraints back at it in X8. Okay. It's already 10 till. Time flies when you're having fun, right? All right, let's switch back over and cover modeling now. So in modeling, this section we're going to look at open profiles. Open profile is an open sketch used to add or remove material. And for example, we're looking at this in the extrude and revolve command. We're going to look at the new emboss body command. We're going to look at the Boolean commands. For example, unite. You're able to define regions now. Just mentionable items, you can draft from multiple faces and surfaces now. There's a delete body command. What this delete body command is going to do is, let's say I have another body. If I go in and select the delete body command, delete the body, I'll now have an entry in my navigator, my part navigator, as a history. So then I could suppress the delete body or get rid of the delete body, and then the body would reappear. So it's a way of deleting the body parametrically rather than just hitting delete and then have to recreate that maybe later. There's some new helical options, and then being able to lock formulas on expressions. So first of all, this open profiles in extrude or revolve. Here I have an open profile. This is 3 sides, 3 sketch lines. I have not projected the bottom of the distributor cap as to close the sketch. It is truly open. As we extrude that up, there's a new option here in NX 8.5 called Open Profile Smart Volume. As you toggle that on, notice how it's going to add material inside of that sketch back to where it meets the existing solid. Okay, and we're going to talk about some different options and ways that that can help you speed up creating some features. The next slide is Emboss Body. Here I have a sheet body, a surface, going through that wall of that model. If you go to Emboss Body, you're going to select the target, select the tool, which is the sheet, and it's going to pick up that that's a thinned part or shelled part. It picks up the thickness, and not only is it doing kind of that dimple shape to the outside, it's doing it to the inside. So I just want to make you aware of that tool. I'll show you that live just in a minute. The Boolean commands, so for example, unite. If I do target and a tool, there's a new option that I can turn on called define regions, as you see in this region group. For example, you see these green bodies versus the gray body. Before the unite, if you come in here and unite those, notice how they do not extend across. What we did there is we went into select region and say, I want to remove those bodies. So what this is doing for us, instead of uniting it and then coming in and doing some kind of extruded cutout and removing that with secondary features, we're able to do that with options and regions definition inside the unite command, with one feature. Same thing here in the front. We have the blue body versus the gray body. Notice that gray piece, that region has been removed. Also, the extending blue faces have been removed. So now this is all one body, and we're just showing the faces for illustration purposes. Now you can draft from a non-planar face, multiple faces, both sides of a parting surface, one side of a parting surface, a planar face or surface, which we've always been able to do. The biggest thing is being able to pick multiple faces for your from reference for your draft. New helical options. First of all, you're going to notice a new updated dialog. You're going to notice now we can actually add a helical to a spine. So here I just have a B-spline curve. Here's the different types we can use. The new option here with types, we've been able to do by a law curve for diameter, but now we can do by law curve for pitch. Okay, so what you're noticing in these examples is a law curve defining the pitch. So it's really tight here. It gets to a certain point, it starts opening up to a larger pitch. Then to another point, it starts closing up. Okay, so the new part of that is being able to define that with pitch. and also being able to define that along a spine, which I'll show you. And finally, here is a mentionable item in the expressions dialog. I can right-click on an expression or a formula, right-click and say lock formula. User will get feedback that it is now locked. You see this little wrench, it's kind of hard to see on the slide. It's not going to keep it from updating. The value can change, but the user cannot drive that value, right? We can't change the formula until it is unlocked. This is just another tool in our tool bag to help maintain design intent in our models. All right, let's go ahead and come back over to NX. Let's just start back at that base feature, that distributor cap, and kind of model some of this along. First of all, let's take a look at the open profile. So I'm going to come in here, and what we saw on the slide, let me go ahead and restart that. I want to make sure I grab from an edge. So I have connected to that edge in this case. Okay, and using our new constraints dialog, I want to put a midpoint or line of midpoint to the origin, so that's centered. I'm going to go ahead and take advantage of my continuous auto dimension for the width, and rather than using that auto dimension there, I'm going to go ahead and dimension this off center. Maybe I know what that is off of center. All right, so we'll close our sketch. So I have an open profile. So by default, this is the behavior you've seen in the past, right? You see the little asterisks, the little stars showing that that is an open profile. Therefore, the result is that sheet body or surface. Okay, here's the new option inside of 8.5. If I toggle on that open profile smart volume, notice here I have unite. So as I change my extent, just as we've always done, notice how it's actually adding material back in towards the existing body. So I didn't have to build the extra curves. It's smart enough to add material back to the existing body. Here I'm doing a unite. If I change that to a subtract, you see that it's going to remove material inside that open profile all the way through the body. The height is still in my extent, right, 2 inches. There is a side step here. I can flip the material side. So if I double click that arrow, see how now it's going to remove material outside the profile all the way through with my extent height. Right? If I toggle that back to the inside, then it's removing material back to the inside of the profile. If I change that back to unite, then that's the result I want. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit OK. I'll do another example here in a minute just to kind of get some more features on there up to that point. I'm going to go ahead and draft some faces. Right, this is a plastic part here, so draft that. My faces here, we'll draft that 1 degree. Grab my normal faces. Make sure we got our faces. Okay, those are drafted. I'm going to go ahead and add some edge blends. Once again, I'm just using that floating toolbar. Remember the see-through preview. Go ahead and apply a 1/4 inch to those. Go ahead and make the ones on the new feature a little smaller. Grab some other edges here. Okay, that looks good. And we also want to shell out the part. So I'm just going to do a shell operation to 0.1. Remember that 0.1 within that part there. So now we can see the inside of it. What I want to do is I want to create a little rib down in there. See, I'm just going to create an offset plane 2.5 inches down there. I want to create a rib that runs all the way across that part, maybe a strengthening rib or part of a network there. And I'm just going to go to extrude, and we'll look at the open profile, another example of open profile. Here, I'm going to take my line, or my profile, and notice how I'm just drawing part of it. I didn't draw the line all the way across. So I'm just going to close the sketch. Obviously, it's just creating that sheet by default, right? Whatever height of my extent. If I turn on the open profile smart volume, notice how it's adding material inside that profile, or actually which side of the profile, in this case to the left, and it mates up with that, what we call smart volume. If I double click the material side, see how it's adding material on the other side. Well, what I really want to do to create a rib is do an offset, create a symmetric offset, so create that rib across here. Notice as I adjust the extent, how it's adding material across that series of blends down at the bottom. So with that smart volume is truly intelligent about how it extends material. Remember, I just drew a little tiny segment of that line. even if I flip the direction, right, notice how my extent is way down below the part, 2 inches, but notice how it stopped adding material where it mates up with that smart volume, as we call it. So what you're noticing is really, in this case, I don't have to do the until extended. I still can, but notice how it extends across till it meets material, and really in both directions. So there we have our rib just with a line. I didn't have to worry about closing that boundary off. Okay, the next thing is the embossed body. I know I'm at 1 o'clock. Give me 5-10 more minutes. I apologize for running over. I'm just going to show this sheet body that we're working with. And I want to create kind of that dimple shape. So if I run up here and go to Insert, Combine, Emboss Body, I'm going to select the target. Notice as soon as I grab that target, it actually picks up the thickness of what my part is. Remember the 0.1 I shelled it to? I'm going to go ahead and grab this sheet as a tool. There's an optional clearance in there, so I can actually move the solid away from the surface, give a little extra clearance in between there. But what you're going to notice is not only did it take that shape on the outside, but because of that thicken option, it took that shape on the inside. Very, very neat. I want to make you aware of the tool. And obviously I could do something like, you know, pattern that feature around. We'll do a circular pattern about the center. Put 4 of those halfway around. So obviously we just pattern those to maintain that shape. Actually pattern my other feature down there too. That's all right. All right. Just a couple things. I want to show you some finished examples of, actually we got to unite yet. I apologize for that. Let me blow that pattern away for a second. And what we want to do is I have another solid body in here. So I'm going to display another solid body. So I have what I was working on, and then I have this extruded feature which has some draft associated to it. It's actually tapered down there a little bit, and it's extending through that face. Well, if I go to Unite, select this as my target, this is my tool. If I hit OK, that's going to become all one solid body as it sits right now. Well, new with 8.5, I can do the define regions, say what do I want to keep or remove. I want to remove this region here. So notice how it takes away that region and leaves what I did not select in this case. So I'm able to do that with one operation rather than coming back with other extruded cutouts or other trim bodies downstream. Just to show you a couple of those examples on the helical, if I open up this finished example, what I have here, first of all, I have the diameter of 0.5 along with the pitch. That's why it's sitting on top of each other. But a couple things about this. First of all, if you look at this sketch I have highlighted, I have a line, arc, line. If I come back into the helix, I can say a long spine now, select that line, arc, line, and the first thing you're going to notice is the new dialog, right? The dialog's been updated. I can also have edit handles, right? We started to see a lot of edit handles in the Next over the last several releases. So if I want to rotate that helical, if I want to come over here to the endpoint and drag that endpoint, so instead of it going down the entire curve, I only want it to go down 75% of the curve. And the reason why I'm able to change the length is here with method, instead of turns, I can say limits. So it's going from 0 to now 75% of the way down that path. Also notice how I had it adjusting the diameter. It started at 1 inch, went to 2 inches in the middle, and then back down to 1 inch. Let's take a look at another example that I had a screenshot of the on the slides, the PowerPoint slides. So what you're going to notice here is here's my sketch. This is just a B-spline curve using the Studio Spline command on a sketch. It's on the plane in this case. If I look at the helix, here I've done along a spine again. Here I've done everything constant. It's a constant 2 inch diameter down. It's a constant 0.5 pitch in between. But here was the limits, right? It's starting at 0 the spine, going to 100%. I can drag that back down to wherever I want it. Maybe I want that to be at 75 like I did in the last example. The other thing, not only we looked at spinning that, but also drag handles to adjust the diameter, right? So if I drag that up to 2.5, obviously I update the helix curve, and then the tube is going to update on top of it, whether it's a sweep along guide or in this case I use a tube. The point is we can do it along spine. Also, as mentioned on the slide, we can also do a law curve for pitch as well as diameter. Okay, so I know that went pretty quick. We went through user interface, sketcher modeling, and then we're going to conclude with part 2 on April 18th. We'll look at what's new in synchronous modeling, sheet metal, drafting, and then other if time permits. If you want more information on some of the topics we've discussed today, or even more general what's new in NX, you can go to Help and select the What's New guide from Help, and you'll get kind of the hyperlink. There's CAD modeling, CAD drafting, CAD synchronous modeling. You can navigate through there. As always, our Ally PLM Lunch Bytes series, we put our replays up on our website, www.allyplm.com. If you go to Lunch Bytes, then you'll see the green arrow for Lunch Bytes replays. This is also where you can see what's the next topics are. We see March 14th today, part 1, April 18th, part 2. Also notice we're starting to do NX CAM Lunch Bytes. So if you're interested in CAM or do CAM, keep those in mind. One other thing here, we mentioned the training promotion earlier in the session. Here's the next dates for the Essentials class, the beginner class for new users, the 5-day CAD class. Coming in June, we're doing a CAM fundamental, starting to do that. And a side note, all of our classes can be taught online. It's still instructor-led, but we have tools, speakers, and etc. So there'll be basically they can still be instructor-led and taught online. If you want more information, just go to our website. Thanks for your attention this afternoon. I hope you found this session informative. Like I said earlier, if you have any suggestions for future Lunch Byte topics, email those to us or go to our website and put those in the little request area. Also, if you had any questions during this session, send me an email. Appreciate your time. Like I said, let us know if you have any questions. And also, we'll continue this discussion on what's new in NX 8.5 CAD on April 18th. Thanks, and have a great afternoon.